On the morning of February 1st, 1943, First Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg guided his B-17 flying fortress, the All-American, toward the target zone over Tunis, Tunisia. It was just after 9 a.m., and the airspace above the burning docks was alive with danger. German fighters were already circling. Bragg, 26 years old, had flown 41 combat missions. Not a single aircraft under his watch had been lost, but today would test every ounce of resolve, leadership, and engineering brilliance that Bragg and his crew could summon. The mission had begun hours earlier from Biskra airfield in Algeria. The 414th Bomb Squadron of the 97th Bomb Group had been ordered to hit enemy supply ships feeding Rommel's Africa Corps. The success of the North African campaign depended on cutting those lines. When the bombs fell, they struck true. The docks erupted in fire and chaos. But survival wasn't about bombs. It was about making it home. And once the bombers turned for base, they entered what aircrews grimly called the gauntlet. It was the deadliest time of every mission. German fighters pounced on returning bombers, knowing their bomb bay doors were still open, formations disrupted. Bragg's formation was still tightening back into defensive shape when two Messerschmitts came screaming in. One went for the lead bomber, the other for All-American. Bragg's bombardier, Ralph Burbridge, opened fire with the nose guns. The German fighter kept coming. Whether hit or disabled, the enemy aircraft didn't pull away. It slammed into All-American. The impact was catastrophic. The German fighter's wing sliced through All-American's vertical stabilizer and continued diagonally through the fuselage, nearly severing the aircraft in half. Bragg wrestled the controls, but they went slack. Through the yawning gash in the rear fuselage, he could see open sky. A portion of the tail was gone. His co-pilot, Godfrey Engel, reached for his parachute. Navigator Harry Null turned and uttered a single fateful word: bail. But Bragg didn't. He checked his instruments. 4 engines were still turning, 2 coughing, 1 running hot, but still turning. Altitude was holding. Somehow the bomber still flew. The decision had to come fast: jump into enemy territory or attempt the unthinkable, fly a crippled fortress home. He climbed out of his seat and surveyed the damage. The tail gunner, Sam Sarpololis, was miraculously still in position, alive, and cut off by a 16-foot void where the fuselage had once been. The tail was now hanging by little more than one side frame. Every gust, every vibration threatened to rip it away. The intercom was dead, the oxygen system was gone, the electricals were failing, but one chance remained. Engineer Joe James informed Bragg that while the main systems were shot, the Norden bombsight autopilot system was still functional. It had its own wiring, its own servos mounted near the rudder and elevators. Designed to stabilize the aircraft during bombing runs, it wasn't meant for sustained flight, but it was all they had. Bragg gave the order. They'd try to make it home. Burbridge would control flight inputs from the bombardier's station using the autopilot servos. Every command would be relayed and interpreted, flight by proxy. The formation tightened around All-American for mutual defense. For a few minutes they flew under a protective shell. The crew began shedding weight. Waist gunner Mike Zook heaved his 700-pound machine gun into the void. Ammunition, armor, non-essential equipment, all gone. German fighters returned for another pass. Bragg's crew fought them off with what weapons remained. Eventually, the Messerschmitts vanished, low on fuel or out of range. The formation pulled ahead. The crippled B-17 was on its own. They were 90 miles from home. Every moment became a fight against gravity, drag, and structural collapse. The damaged tail acted like a parachute trying to pull them apart. Bragg traded altitude for airspeed, trying to find the fine line where the plane wouldn't stall or shake itself to pieces. Then came another blow. The No. 3 engine began to overheat and smoke. It seized up and locked the propeller, dragging the bomber into a spiral. With no rudder control, Bragg used throttle adjustments alone to stabilize the aircraft. His hands ached, his knees locked. Every muscle in his body strained to keep the bomber level. But even that wouldn't be enough. They were losing altitude, not fast, but steadily, 100 feet per minute. At that rate, they would run out of sky 20 miles short of base. Something had to give. Bragg made a bold decision: dump fuel. They carried 200 gallons in the auxiliary tanks. Fuel meant range, but it also meant weight. Without altitude, range was useless. The crew obeyed. Fuel sprayed from the bomb bay, shedding 1,200 pounds in 30 seconds. It worked. They stabilized at 7,500 feet, but the autopilot servos were overheating. Designed for short bursts, they were now running continuously under load. No one knew how long they would hold. 5 minutes? 30? The crew watched the minutes crawl by. The desert below was an unforgiving sprawl of rock and silence. If the servos failed, there would be no control, no chance. Then, with Biskra within sight, the worst fear became real. The tail started to separate. It flexed, peeled, twisted in the slipstream. Bragg could see it from the cockpit. There were no options left. The crew prepared to bail out, but what of Sarpalolis? The tail gunner was still trapped in a section about to break free. Co-pilot Engel crawled to the edge of the gash. He called for Sarpalolis to come forward. The gunner moved inch by inch, crawling across the flexing, groaning metal. The gap between the sections was 3 feet. Engel and James threw him a length of parachute cord. He tied it to his wrist. They pulled. He leaped. His boots scraped the fuselage edge. They dragged him in. Seconds later, the tail, now unweighted, began to tear even more violently. They were still 23 miles out. Bragg throttled back, reducing strain but sacrificing altitude. The needle dipped to 6,000 feet, then 5,000. He could see the airfield now: trucks, tents, other bombers already safe. Ground crews turned their eyes skyward. A red flare burst from All-American's cockpit. Emergency landing inbound. The entire runway was cleared. This landing would be their final challenge. Bragg lowered the gear. The main wheels locked. The tail wheel attached to the severing tail didn't. The descent began. 2,000 feet, then 1,000. Too fast. He pulled back, slowing, leveling. 800 feet, 400, 200. At 100 feet, he held the nose high, trying to let the main wheels take the load. The bomber touched down. Dust exploded from the ground. The tail collapsed. Sparks flew. Screeching metal echoed across the field. The tail finally tore away, skidding behind them, and the bomber slowed. 70, 60, 30. Then silence. All-American rolled to a stop 800 yards down the runway. Every crew member walked away unharmed. The damage was unimaginable. The tail was gone. The fuselage ripped wide open, 2 engines destroyed, control systems severed. But the aircraft had made it home. Engineers swarmed. Photographs were taken. The now famous image of All-American, sunlight shining through the empty rear fuselage, would become one of the most iconic images of the war. It was more than a symbol of survival. It was proof of engineering triumph. The B-17, designed in 1935, was the result of choices no other manufacturer made. Boeing had built the airframe around an internal skeleton, not the skin. Semi-monocoque structure with deep ring frames and multiple longitudinal stringers ensured that even if part of the aircraft was destroyed, the structure could hold. Most aircraft used the skin to carry loads, not the B-17. All-American had lost an entire horizontal stabilizer, half its fuselage, 2 engines, and it flew. It flew because the right side members carried the load alone, because the wing spar, independent of the fuselage, was untouched, because the aircraft had been over-engineered, and that decision saved lives. Within a week, engineers arrived at Biskra to study the damage. Their findings influenced the design of every Allied bomber that followed. Reinforcements were added to B-24s. Redundant control paths were built into Lancasters. The B-29 Superfortress would be born from these hard-won lessons, and All-American, it flew again. Repaired in 6 weeks, it was reassigned to the 301st Bomb Group. It flew over Italy, over Sicily, through 2 more years of war. Crews said it flew differently, slower, rougher, but it brought them home. It completed 118 combat missions. On March 6, 1945, it was finally declared beyond repair, not from damage, but from age. Kendrick Bragg completed his tour in June 1943. He never spoke publicly about that February mission. He didn't need to. The photograph said everything. A bomber, broken in half, still flying. A testament to courage, resolve, and engineering that put survival above all. Today, only 4 B-17s still fly, but their echo thunders at every air show. That unmistakable roar of 4 radial engines still brings eyes skyward. And somewhere, in a museum or a memory, All-American flies again. Not just as an aircraft, but as a promise.